stop scrolling for 1 second. I don't care what you were about to do. If you live anywhere from the plains, through the Mississippi Valley, into the Ohio Valley, the Mid-Atlantic, or down along the Gulf Coast, you need to hear this before you plan the next 7 days of your life. Because right now, as I'm recording this on August 7th, we are sitting on the edge of one of those pattern changes that meteorologists talk about for weeks before it happens, and then it happens all at once. We've had a heat dome parked over the plains in the southwest for going on 2 weeks. Triple-digit heat, ground-baked dry, and that's about to get shoved out of the way by something completely different. A more active, stormier setup that's going to bring flooding rain, damaging thunderstorm winds, a tornado threat in more than one region. And on top of all of that, we are watching the Atlantic and the Gulf for tropical development in the exact same window. Not next month. This week and next week. This is not a one-day story. This is a multi-day sequence, and I need you to understand the shape of it now, because the shape is what's going to keep you and your family safe. So let's get into it, because there's a lot to cover. Before I tell you where we're going, you need to understand where we've been, because this shift doesn't happen in a vacuum. For the last 2 weeks, we've had a big, stubborn upper-level ridge. Think of it like a dome of high pressure sitting up around 18,000 to 30,000 feet, parked over the western U.S., the northern Rockies, and pushing into the plains. Underneath that ridge, air sinks. When air sinks, it compresses and warms up. That's why places from Arizona and Nevada up through Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and even into Alberta have been baking under some of the most intense heat of the summer, with temperatures pushing well past 100 degrees in spots that don't normally see that kind of heat this consistently. That ridge has also been doing something else. It's been acting like a wall. It shoved the jet stream, which is basically the river of air way up in the atmosphere that steers storm systems, north and out of the way. That's part of why the central U.S. has been so dry under this ridge, while at the same time, other parts of the country have been dealing with a completely different problem. A much wetter, stormier setup across the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Northeast, with repeated rounds of rain keeping soil saturated in some spots, even while the plains cracked open from dryness. So already, before we even get to the shift, you can see we've had a country split in half, hot and dry on one side, wet and stormy on the other. That kind of split doesn't last. The atmosphere hates staying lopsided for too long, and that's exactly what's about to break. Here's the actual physics of it, and I'm going to keep this simple because you don't need a meteorology degree to understand your risk, you just need to understand the shape of what's coming. That ridge that's been sitting over the west and the plains is starting to break down. When a ridge breaks down, it doesn't just disappear, it gets replaced by a trough, which is the opposite pattern, a dip in the jet stream that digs south and drags cooler, more unstable air with it. Right now, the signal in the models is that a trough digs in and shifts east toward the Great Lakes as we move into the next several days. That's a big deal, because a digging trough does 3 things at once. It kicks up wind shear, it draws moisture northward out of the Gulf, and it forces that moisture to rise and condense into storms. At the surface, we've also got a shallow area of low pressure that's been sliding eastward out of the mid-Mississippi Valley toward the southeast. When that surface low interacts with the digging trough overhead, you get what we call a coupled system. Surface features and upper-level features working together instead of against each other. That's the recipe for organized, sometimes long-lived severe weather instead of just scattered pop-up storms. Now, layer on top of that the moisture. This is where the flash flooding piece comes in, and I want to be really direct with you. Flash flooding is not the sidekick story here. It is just as dangerous, if not more statistically dangerous, than the tornado threat. And I'm going to treat it that way the entire time we're talking today. We've already seen a busy pattern of slow-moving thunderstorms drenching the central and eastern U.S. this week, with some communities picking up a couple of inches of rain in just a few hours. When you get thunderstorms that train, meaning they repeatedly fire over the same corridor instead of moving through, that's when a 2-inch rain event turns into a 4, 5, 6-inch rain event. And that's when creeks that were bone dry last week start climbing out of their banks. And then there's Mukapi. I know that sounds like alphabet soup, so let me break it down. Mukapi stands for most unstable convective available potential energy. All that really means is how much fuel is available in the atmosphere for a thunderstorm to explode upward once it gets going. Higher Mukapi means a storm, once triggered, can build taller and stronger, faster. Right now we're watching values that, odd in the Mississippi Valley and Ohio Valley, are more than capable of supporting strong to severe thunderstorms if the trigger mechanism lines up. And that trigger is exactly what that digging trough and surface low are going to provide over the next several days. Okay, let's map this out day by day because I don't want you just hearing big changes coming and walking away confused. I want you to know what to watch for and when. We're still in transition. The heat dome is loosening its grip but hasn't fully let go, especially across the south central plains and the lower Mississippi Valley. where afternoon highs are still going to feel oppressive, especially with humidity factored in. At the same time, on out ahead of that approaching system, expect increasing shower and thunderstorm activity strung out from the plains and Midwest into the Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic. Some of these storms are going to be capable of producing localized flash flooding, damaging wind gusts, and large hail, especially anywhere storms can train over the same area for an extended period. If you're in Chicago, the surrounding Midwest, or anywhere along that plains to Midwest corridor, Friday into Saturday is a day I want you watching your radar app, not just checking the forecast once in the morning and calling it done. This is where the pattern shift really shows its teeth. Expect the trough to continue digging and shifting toward the Great Lakes, which means the focus for the more organized, severe weather threat, that's your damaging wind, large hail, and an isolated tornado threat, likely shifts toward the Ohio Valley and into parts of the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. This is also where I want you to start paying very close attention to the flash flood threat along the Gulf Coast and the Southeast, because we are also watching for weak tropical moisture, trying to organize and move in from the Atlantic or the Northern Caribbean during this exact window. Even a disorganized tropical disturbance can dump tropical downpour rates without ever needing a name, and when you combine that kind of tropical rainfall efficiency with already saturated ground in parts of the southeast, you get flash flooding potential that punches above its weight class compared to what the wind field looks like on a map. By this stretch, the heat dome that's been dominating the plains starts to give more ground, but don't get too comfortable, because extreme heat doesn't just vanish, it often relocates. Signals are pointing toward that heat re-anchoring across the south central and southeastern U.S., meaning the southern plains. The lower Mississippi Valley and into the southeast could see another round of dangerous heat build back in even as the storm threat plays out to their north and east. Meanwhile, out in the desert southwest and southern Great Basin, an enhanced monsoon flow is expected to bring periods of heavy, localized downpours. And if you've spent any time out there, you know monsoon flash flooding in canyons and dry arroyos is its own special kind of dangerous because it can rise with almost no warning, even when it's not raining directly over you. This is the window I'm watching closest of anyone right now, because this is when the Climate Prediction Center's medium-range outlook is flagging a moderate risk of extreme heat returning to the southern and central plains and the lower Mississippi Valley, right alongside continued monsoon flooding risk in the southwest. And this is also smack in the middle of the window that hurricane forecasters are watching for potential tropical development in the Atlantic Basin, somewhere between roughly August 9th and 15th. I want to be careful here and not get ahead of the data. Nobody can tell you today exactly where a system forms or where it tracks 2 weeks out. But I can tell you the ingredients are aligning in a way that means the Gulf Coast and Southeast need to have their hurricane plan dusted off and ready. Not because I'm certain something's coming, but because being ready costs you nothing and being unprepared can cost you everything. I want to pause here and really hammer this point because I think a lot of weather coverage gets this backwards. Everybody's eyes go straight to the word tornado on a graphic, and flooding gets treated like a footnote. That is exactly backwards from what the data tells us. Flash flooding and damaging straight-line winds can affect a much larger area than a tornado ever will, and they kill people just as effectively, sometimes more effectively, because people underestimate water. You've heard the phrase, turn around, don't drown. And I need you to actually live by it this week, not just nod along. 6 inches of moving water can knock an adult off their feet. 12 to 18 inches can float a car. And the scariest part is that a lot of flash flood deaths happen at night, in a vehicle, on a road the driver has taken 100 times before, because it's never flooded like that before, until the one night it does. With the setup we've got, training thunderstorms, tropical moisture trying to work in from the south, and ground that in some spots is either already saturated from recent rain, or in other spots, so parched from the heat dome that it can't absorb water fast enough and just sheds it straight into creeks and low-lying roads. I am treating this flooding threat as a co-equal headline to the severe storm and tornado risk this week. Not a footnote, not an afterthought. A headline. Let's talk about the storm mode, because this matters for how you prepare. When we get a digging trough interacting with a surface low and a good moisture feed like we're expecting, one of the most common outcomes isn't a bunch of isolated photogenic supercells. It's often a QLCS, that stands for quasi-linear convective system. In plain English, that's a squall line, a long line of thunderstorms that marches across the landscape as basically one connected feature instead of separate storm cells. Why does that matter to you? Because QLCS tornadoes behave differently than the tornadoes you see in storm-chasing footage from a big supercell out on the plains. QLCS tornadoes tend to spin up fast, with very little lead time, often embedded inside heavy rain where you can't even see them coming visually. They're usually shorter-lived and weaker on average than supercell tornadoes, but because the warning time is so short, they can still catch people off guard in a dangerous way. If you get a tornado warning during a squall line event, I don't want you standing at the window trying to spot a funnel before you take cover. By the time you'd see it, if you could see it at all, you may not have time left to react. Get to your safe space the moment that warning is issued for your location, every single time, no exceptions. There's also something called a cap that I want to quickly explain, because it explains why some days that looks scary on paper end up quiet, and some days that don't look that impressive end up producing. The cap is a layer of warm air sitting above the surface that acts like a lid on a pot, suppressing thunderstorm development even when there's plenty of instability building up underneath it. When the cap holds, you build up energy without anything happening, sometimes for days. When the cap finally breaks, or when a strong enough trigger like a cold front or a jet stream disturbance punches through it, all that pent-up energy gets released at once, and you can go from a quiet afternoon to a violent squall line in under an hour. That's part of why forecasting the exact timing of severe weather in a setup like this is genuinely hard. Even for professionals with all the model data in front of them, the cap is the wild card that decides whether today is the day or whether we push it to tomorrow. I say this every time, and I'm going to keep saying it, because weather information without action attached to it is just noise. Here's what I need from you this week, region by region. If you're in the Plains, Midwest, or Ohio Valley, keep a way to receive warnings that doesn't rely on you remembering to check an app. A NOAA weather radio, wireless emergency alerts turned on, something that will wake you up if a warning fires at 2 a.m. Squall lines love to roll through overnight, and overnight tornadoes are disproportionately deadly because people are asleep and don't get the warning in time to react. If you're in the mid-Atlantic, southeast, or anywhere near the Gulf Coast, this is your flash flood reminder. Do not drive around a barricade. Do not try to guess how deep the water on the road actually is. If your normal route home is through a low-lying area or near a creek that's given you trouble before, have a backup route in your head before you need it, not while you're already sitting in rising water. If you're in the desert southwest, monsoon flash flooding can happen even under a blue sky miles away from you, because that rain falling in the mountains has to go somewhere, and it funnels straight down through canyons and arroyos. If you're hiking or camping near a wash, know your exit before you need it. And if you're anywhere along the Gulf Coast or the southeast Atlantic coastline, this is the moment to check your hurricane supplies. Not because I'm telling you a storm is guaranteed. I'm not. But the tropical development window lines up with everything else we're talking about today, and the sensible move is to have a plan ready before you need one, not scrambling for batteries and water the day a system gets a name. I'm going to be watching a few very specific things over the next several days, and I want you watching them with me. I'm watching how far east that digging trough actually shifts, because that determines whether the Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic take the brunt of the organized severe threat, or whether it slides further north into the Great Lakes and spares some of those southern areas a little. I'm watching the moisture return into the Gulf and how efficiently it feeds northward, because that's the difference between scattered showers and a legitimate multi-inch rainfall event. I'm watching the Atlantic and the Gulf for any signs of organization in that tropical disturbance window between the 9th and the 15th, because even a weak, disorganized system can be a floodmaker without ever needing a name. And I'm watching how quickly that heat dome tries to rebuild across the south-central U.S. once this active stretch passes through, because these patterns rarely just resolve cleanly. More often, they oscillate. Heat building back in right as everyone thinks the dangerous stretch is over. Zoom out with me for 1 second. This isn't a random, isolated event popping up out of nowhere. This is the atmosphere doing what it does in August during a year like this one, oscillating between blocking patterns that lock in heat and drought, and active patterns that unleash flooding and severe weather, sometimes within the same week, sometimes in the same region, just days apart. We've got a moderate El Niño signal in play this year, which tends to load the dice towards certain patterns without guaranteeing any single outcome. It's not a crystal ball, it's a nudge. Forecasters have flagged the southeast and southern mid-Atlantic for both above normal heat odds and, at the same time, watched tropical waters off those same coastlines as a trouble spot heading into this exact stretch of August. That's not a contradiction. That's exactly how these patterns work. The same air mass that bakes a region for 10 days can be the fuel source for the flooding rain that follows it, because all the heat and humidity has to go somewhere once the pattern finally breaks. So when I tell you this is a huge shift, I don't mean it as a headline to get you to click. I mean it in the literal meteorological sense. We are moving from a blocked, lopsided pattern into an active, multi-hazard pattern across a huge chunk of the country in a compressed window of about 7 to 10 days. That's the kind of setup that produces the video clips you see later of flooded interstates and downed trees. And I would much rather you see this video today and take it seriously than see those clips next week and wonder why nobody told you. So here's where I'll leave you. Over the next several days, watch the heat ease in the plains and southwest before it tries to rebuild in the south-central U.S. Watch the storm threat organize and shift toward the Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, and Great Lakes this weekend. Treat the flash flood threat with the same seriousness as the severe storm threat, because this week they are equally dangerous. And keep one eye on the tropics between now and the 15th, because the window for something to try to organize in the Atlantic or Gulf lines up perfectly with everything else we've talked about today. I'll be back with updates as this evolves, because setups like this rarely go exactly the way the models show them 7 days out. They shift, they speed up, they slow down, and sometimes they surprise all of us. Make sure you're subscribed and you've got notifications on, because when this pattern starts to show its final hand, I want you to be the first to know, not the last. Stay weather aware, stay ready, and I'll see you in the next one.